When this idea came together for a Hope Clinic fundraiser, you had to get your juices flowing a little bit, knowing that some of your artwork would be on display.
Hearing about their cause and what they've achieved, I'm even more and more delighted that I was able to be a participant. Marvelous work, and it's just a great cause.
The Hope Clinic, of course, as you've been learning tonight, benefits many people. Your art speaks to many people. Tell us a little bit about the background of how this all started for you.
Guess it started at Quebec City, Canada, at the General Hospital where I was born. And when, shortly after that, my father accepted a position as an engineer, corporate engineer for a paper company in Upper Quebec province. And we were there until I was 5 years old. And happily, he received an invitation to come to Chillicothe and be a part of the Mead Corporation, for which I am everlastingly grateful. Canada was fine, but the roots or the formative years of growing up here has just had an immeasurable effect and lasting. And it became a goal once I graduated from Chillicothe High School, went to art school for 4 years, and then the U.S. Army determined they couldn't do without my services for 2 years. After the Army, went back to Chicago because it was a city we knew, and I felt that that was realistically where I could realize a livelihood at that time as a commercial artist, doing ads and some illustrations, small things. But it was during that time that I would take 2 weeks vacation and come back to Chillicothe, rent a room, and go out in the morning, do a painting on location, come in for lunch, go back out into the field and do another, and did that for about 2 weeks, and then would take those back to Chicago and exhibit in the outdoor fairs that were going on. And it was a case of gradually becoming more and more dissatisfied with the commercial art field and more involved in doing landscapes of Ross County. The formative years just meant so much of growing up here. I do remember when I would go back to Chicago with my paintings, my colleagues at the studio would all want to see what I'd been up to these 2 weeks. And particularly one painting caught one of the artists' eye because it was of a mud puddle on Sulphur Springs Road. And my friend said, "Let me get this straight. You drove 400 miles to paint a mud puddle?" I said, "You don't understand. That mud puddle was in Ross County. All the difference." Anyway, as soon as it became feasible that I could, with gallery representation in Chicago, Joy and I, my wife now of 66 years, moved back to Chillicothe and never looked back to the days in Chicago, but again, grateful for that training.
You came along in Chillicothe kind of on the heels of Billy Ireland a little bit.
Oh my.
How many years separation was there?
Billy Ireland passed in 1935, and we came to Chillicothe from Canada in 1937, so I just missed him. But I had the great pleasure and honor of cutting mats for some of Billy Ireland's cartoons that the Ross County Historical Society wanted to have for a bicentennial exhibit back in 1976 when the nation was celebrating 200 years. And just to study Billy Ireland's authoritative pen and ink work, and bearing in mind he did these weekly. I mean, he had to come up with the ideas and then execute them and get them ready for the printer week after week. And they were all, it was a badge of honor to be included in a Billy Ireland's Passing show on a Sunday afternoon or Sunday morning edition.
It would be tough as an artist to be fresh week after week after week.
You know, Dan, that's one of the reasons I felt I'm not cut out for commercial art. The demands on time. The old gag was they'd bring an assignment in, and when do you want this? Well, we want it tomorrow. If we wanted it tomorrow, we'd give it to you. Well, whatever. We want it today. We'd give it to you tomorrow if we wanted it tomorrow. You know, it was, but it was good training in that you didn't wait for the right phase of the moon to get inspired. You just sat down and did it. And I marveled at the pros that had been doing this for 10, 15, 30 years, and they were just like machines. But the saddest aspect, when they heard I was leaving the studio to go back to Ross County to do paintings, one of the questions was, well, how will you know what to paint? Sad. And to me, there are not enough hours in the day or days in the week to do all that I would like to do as far as putting my impressions of this land around.
I would have to think the folks in Chicago, and I don't think it's any different today now, 50, 60 years later, those that live in the big metropolis areas, they all want what rural America gives them.
It seems to be, and not only Chicago, a gallery in Florida used to represent my work, and they would say, you can send as many snowscapes down here as you want. They don't mind looking at paintings. They love them of snow, but they just don't want to live in it. But many of them would have once resided in the Midwest, and there was a familiarity to it. But what attracted, aside from being home and where a lot of friends lasting became very close, it was just the land itself, the variety of terrain. You go toward Clarksburg, that's one kind of land, and then go down toward MacArthur. You get that endless variety of undulation and the history of this region, really significant. First capital of Ohio, and well, you mentioned Billy Ireland, and there have been other artists that have found much favor with the physical aspect of it. But then there's, as I say, that sentimental and emotional. When I go out to a place, it's not only for the visual aspects, but there's a connection. I either had experiences growing up there, or I knew the people that were connected with that. I remember walking with friends when I was 8 or 9. We grew up on Carlisle Hill, and on a Saturday afternoon or Sunday, we'd walk back over the backside of Bellevue Hill along Plyley's Lane until we came to the confluence of North Fork and Paint Creek, and we'd trace North Fork all the way back to a place where the water kind of collected and it served a little pool, and we'd go wading. It was deep enough. And one of our more literary members of our 3 or 4 gang decided to call the place Gitche Gumee, based on Hiawatha by Longfellow. And years later, I decided to do a painting called Nearing Gitche Gumee. And then it occurred to me, how on earth do you spell Gitche Gumee? So I had to go to the public library and get the authentic spelling on that. But there were just things like that every place had some memory, and it was more than just a site. I've painted in California, Canada, Michigan, Florida, mainly because of family members living there. But I always felt like a tourist. And here I just felt that connection. My dad, years ago, with a friend, would read the writings of John Ruskin, an English art critic, and they do this in Canada on a wintry night long before television. And just recently I came across a phrase that appealed to me that John Ruskin had once said, and it went like, "Your work should be the praise of what you love." And I just felt, I hope my dad read that, and now I can complete the cycle.
Would it be out of place to say that you paint what you know, and when you come back to Ross County, you've known it all your life, just easy to paint?
Absolutely. I don't know about easy all the time, but yeah, it's never a chore. It's never, as it was in commercial art on occasion, many occasions, it's something I had to do. When I go over to the studio in the morning, I'm anxious to sit down at the easel and see what happens, and just get immersed in the whole aura of where that place is and what it means, aside from the aspects, and we have the advantage not only in the terrain, the topography, but then we have the seasons, 4 distinct seasons, and heaven knows we certainly get a variety of weather, and if you don't like it, 5 minutes later you might have a change, and you can adjust to that. But that's one aspect that commercial art did equip me to do, is in the field to work quickly. I would work right on location and do my reference and bring those back as as an author would do, maybe take journal notes. And you read those notes over, and it ignites that initial experience and brings it back. And that's what I try to do in the field, and then come back to the comfort of a studio. A few years ago, a group called the plein air painting, which means you go work on location and do the complete work. They asked me to give a talk up in Columbus, and I said, well, now I'm just working from sketches I did over the years, and I'm in the studio all the time. That doesn't matter, you've done it, let's hear what you have to say. So I began my talk with saying, it's a pleasure to address this group because I too have suffered mosquito bites, poison ivy, wind-blown and frostbitten feet, and now it's a treat to talk to you, band of painters. It's sort of going to extreme of saying an artist should suffer. But again, sometimes that feeling is incorporated in what you put down.
You'll have to forgive me for my limited knowledge of your paintings, but I know this to be true. You are a landscape artist, and perhaps the only portrait I've ever seen you paint of a person was your self-portrait. What's the reason? At art school, 4 years of working from the model, that's all we did. Full figure and portraits. Did not do one landscape. I didn't do a landscape until I came back to Chillicothe for summer vacation, my first year out of painting class, and I went up on Burr Heights and set up my easel. There were only 2 houses at the brow of the hill back then, and I'm working on this little painting. I had a rather cheap easel that had no anchoring of the canvas, and I'd just about finished, and a breeze came along and blew the canvas right down into the weeds and gravel. Well, there was nobody around, and I began to recite a little Shakespeare, and presently
two little girls came up on their bikes, I would guess 8 and 10 years old, and one of them said, "Our mother said there was a painter back here who might like a drink of water." And they presented me with a canteen, and I said, "Did your mother also include a bar of soap?" But they didn't get my meaning. It's kind of interesting to think that those two little girls are probably on Social Security today. But anyway, there were experiences in the field that were just delightful. I usually pick places where there wasn't anybody, because if somebody stopped, I knew they had questions. And my attention span is fairly delicate, and I would be working thinking of what they're thinking, you know. And so I usually hide out behind in the woods or in a far remote field. And besides, that's my subject matter. But why the landscape over figures? I don't know. I did do a self-portrait. I did about 4 of them, and it was not about to egotism. It's just the model's always available. And that's why Rembrandt did over 60 of them. He would try out different lighting and get different effects that no person wanted to pay for that kind of result. In fact, one of the self-portraits I did, sort of as a discouragement, if somebody came in and said, "Would you paint my portrait?" And I would say, "Oh, of course, if you don't mind looking like this," and I'd turn my self-portrait around, and then they would be more interested in the landscape. But it was a challenge. It's the most difficult thing to portray. You can miss a tree limb by several feet, but you better have somebody's nose length within 1/8 of an inch.
Yeah. It's like calling a play-by-play event on radio compared to TV.
Yes.
You can see it, but on radio, you can make it up.
Oh, and that's how we grew up, listening to Jack Armstrong and Don Winslow of the Navy, and just fantasizing all of. And when anybody was sick, you'd stay home in bed and listen to the soap operas. And the reassuring thing was, if you were sick the next year, things hadn't much changed on the soap operas. You could pick right up where you left off.
I've got 2 more things that I want to ask.
Sure.
One of them, with all these landscapes across Ohio, Ross County, have you ever done the Indian Mountains?
Yes, I have. Excuse me. As a matter of fact, I was out at Mound City, and it was right at the solstice, the December solstice, and I did it with the sun setting, so you had long shadows, and there was a slight cover of snow, and only part of the mound was covered with snow. Where it had thawed on the south side was more bare. But I was thinking about, as I painted that, and getting the shortest day of the year, December 21st, usually, sometimes leap year affects it, but I thought of the mound builders and what a reassuring aspect it would be on December 22nd and 23rd when they saw the days were getting longer. It wasn't going to progress shorter and shorter until it was total darkness. And you appreciate what our forebears understood, and they did. They charted the progression, and they weren't alarmed by December 21st. They knew longer days were coming.
Yeah. The other question I wanted to ask was, who were your inspirations?
Oh, well, seeing Billy Ireland's work, in grade school, I would copy the work of comic strips like Prince Valiant by Hal Foster, or Terry and the Pirates by Milton Caniff and later Steve Canyon, because they worked realistically. they would have models and pose so they get the creases and the wrinkles right in the clothing, and then have actual backgrounds. And that just fascinated. I loved the actual. And then once I graduated from high school and went to art school in Chicago, painters like Winslow Homer and Edward Hopper, the American giants, and then later Andrew Wyeth, had the great honor of meeting Andrew Wyeth in 1963, and at that time Joy and I were still living in Chicago, and I expressed to him what a frustration it was to have to drive 400 miles for my inspiration, and he just insisted. He said, "You have to move back to your source." Well, that was all the confirmation I needed, so we were on our way the next year. But there are several painters, and particularly, though I mentioned Rembrandt and people like Peter Bruegel and John Constable, an Englishman, Claude Monet, a French artist, but it's the Americans that I really study more frequently, because it's our scene. I'm interested in how did they interpret where we live. And sometimes it's a little discouraging. You look at their work and you think that's inhuman how they achieve that. But there are other times when you think, well, yeah, they didn't always nail it, but quite often they sure did.
I guess one thing might be, surely you've sat down and reflected upon your work over the years. Probably, I would imagine you may have done a lot of reflecting here in the last 10 years. What sticks out to you most?
Oh, that's a good question. When I first came back to Chillicothe, I was still under a very strong influence from the style of painting we were taught at the American Academy in Chicago, which was to put things down rather quickly and impressionistically, which served in good stead, because when you go out in the field, the sun doesn't stand still in the sky for you, and the shadows do move, or the clouds come, whatever. But after doing a number of those field sketches, now I find working in the studio, using those as reference, my work is more reflective. I hope more personal. I felt like the works that I was doing in the field resembled a lot of my friends' work in Chicago, because we were all we were all in the same class under the same professor, and he was very influential. We liked what he did, and what he taught seemed to make great sense. But the longer away from that, the more Dan, I gravitated back to doing pencil type detail that I did as a 7 and an 8-year-old. Now, of course, in paint. But for some reason, and maybe it was my father's influence as an engineer, his judging of a painting was, does it look real? And I used to argue the point with him, but down deep I knew he was right. I mean, for me, he was right. There are so many ways. For Dad, a mathematical equation has only one answer. In painting, if you got 100 artists, you've got 100 answers. It's all in an impression and how you see the world, and it's yours to convey to others, and let them take it from there. But it's been such a rewarding pursuit and involvement. I'm just eternally grateful that my father accepted that invitation from the Mead Corporation to come to Chillicothe and Ross County.
This has been a joy of mine. I've always wanted to sit down and have this conversation with you. I'm glad we finally got to it.
Well, the main thing now is put a stop. you get going. Well, anyway, it's been fun, and generally you don't stop action when you're at the easel as a tennis player or a golfer does when they're giving a stroke to the ball. They don't stop action to see whether everything's in position. You just let it flow when you're at the easel, and instinctively, but you hope with some knowledge behind it.
I had kind of wondered at what point in time do you say, okay, that's it. Now I'm going to put my signature on it.
That is a big decision. There's some times when that signature has been painted over. There's always, well, I don't work on one piece at a time. I have several going so that when I come in the morning, I hope to see it freshly. And it gets to the point where you think, well, I've tried about everything as far as solving this composition. There's not many options left. And then you think maybe it is time to sign it. Anyway, it's been fun.